Yeah, hey, this is Harold. I'm just going to make a little separate video on indifference curves and include the last midterm uh, question on that in this video, and so we can kind of go from there. And so let's just share um, our, our screen here, and let me launch into the indifference curves thing. They're it, Indifference curves are just a really valuable tool conceptually. They're just a really valuable tool that economists like to use conceptually to understand how people's preferences line up with the constraints that they face, and how changes in people's preferences or changes in their constraints kind of lead to changes in behavior. Unlike the budget line, indifference curves are not something that we directly observe, but they are conceptually quite useful. We can observe the slope of the indifference curve at a particular point by seeing how people change their behavior, but that's kind of an indirect assumption. By the way, one thing about the indifference curve analysis is there is a lot of rationality assumptions that kind of go into this. So in behavioral economics, there's sometimes behaviors that people display that you're like, it's kind of hard to fit this onto an indifference curve framework. And that's where the sort of mathematical apparatus of economics sometimes falls short of it in being an accurate empirical prediction. So the slope of the indifference curve is called the marginal rate of substitution. And what's interesting about that is how much I'm willing to trade off one good for another. So if the marginal rate of substitution is between, say, books and bagels is 3, basically I'm willing to trade 3 bagels for 1 book at the margin. And so the marginal rate of substitution is at the margin, how am I willing to trade off 2 things? And it turns out that how consumers try to reach the highest indifference curve given their budget line is kind of the fundamental optimization problem that we humans face. And the shapes of the indifference curve have a lot to do with whether certain kinds of goods are substitutes or complements for each other. And we'll talk about income and substitution effects as well. Okay. So your utility is kind of your total well-being. That's really the way we talk about that. And I mentioned this in class already. Here's Ingrid's utility function. She's trying to reach the highest point on this hill she can reach. Here she can get up to 1,050 utils. But how high she can go on this hill depends on what her income is. And in this particular case, she's got restaurant meals, and she's got hotel rooms, and she's got different combinations of those things. And at any given point, one of these lines where her height is exactly the same, that's one indifference curve. So A and B, she's getting 450 utils at A and 450 at B. And so let's say A is she's got 10 restaurant meals and she's got 6 rooms. And A, she has the 10 restaurant meals and she's got 1 room. B, she's got way fewer restaurant meals, but she's got more rooms, and it works out to be the same. What a horrible! We'll just pretend that I never said the last paragraph. Horribly explained. So Ingrid is indifferent between A and B because they're on that same indifference curve. They get the same utility level. So that's really what the indifference curves are trying to capture. Okay. So I don't care where I am along the hill if I'm the same height, if the height is how many utils I have. So here's a different way to show you the same points. A and B are on the same indifference curve, and you can see A, lots of restaurant meals, not too many rooms. B, fewer meals, more rooms, and someone's indifferent between A and B. And notice this bow shape. This bow shape is actually important. Now, what's going on with this bow shape? It's really reflecting the declining marginal utility of stuff. So if I'm way up here, I've got lots of restaurant meals. So this thing isn't quite vertical, but it's getting to be pretty close. And that's basically saying, you give me more restaurant meals, I really am not moving to a higher indifference curve very much over here. Whereas if you give me another room, wow, I'm moving to a higher indifference curve. There's some sort of higher indifference curve that's over here that could be 500 utils. And when the indifference curve is very steep, it's saying whatever's on that vertical axis, I'm not getting too much marginal utility from that anymore. And similarly down here, I got lots of rooms. Give me another room. Yeah, instead of getting 450 utils, maybe I'm getting 455, but I'm not getting much benefit from that 10th room compared to that 9th room, compared to where I would be over here, where I really would be dramatically moving to a higher curve. So the bowed shape reflects declining marginal utility. Okay. So here we see 3 different utility curves, and I'm always trying to get to the highest utility curve I can get to, and they're all sort of bowed, but they bow in a way that's a little different. Okay. I love indifference curves, and as I mentioned, I took this one at the Museum of Science and Industry, and it was a fun picture to take. So utils are a mathematical artifice. They're very, very helpful for us to understand necessities and luxuries, substitutes, complements in a conceptual way. They're very difficult to directly measure. Maybe if we had electrodes in people's brains or something, we could do that, but fortunately we don't. So things to notice about indifference curves. Indifference curves never cross. If you look, for example, at these curves, they have different shapes, but they never actually touch each other. Because if they touch each other, it'd be like saying 450 utils equals 519 utils. They by definition, they cannot intersect. So that's one thing that's important. The further out you go from the origin, the higher your utility. So people, as you get richer, you're on a utility curve that tends to be further away from the origin, because you can just buy more stuff. Indifference curves for ordinary goods are downward sloping. They have that convex shape, is that bowingness. That's what I just said. When indifference curve is really steep, it means the marginal utility of an additional unit on the vertical axis isn't worth much. When it's very flat, it means an additional unit on the horizontal axis isn't worth much to you. I'm sort of satiated. If I have an indifference curve, Doritos are on the x-axis, and I've had 2,000 Doritos, the indifference curve is going to be pretty flat. So here we have, oops, can't have that happen. But just here's different curves. And the slope here is going to be the marginal rate of substitution. And that, that'll be an important concept. It's how much I'm willing to trade off one for the other. When here the slope is really steep, it's basically saying, wow, I'd be willing to give up a lot of restaurant meals just to have one more room. And over here, it'd be saying, I'd be willing to give up a lot of rooms to get one more meal. That's what that slope is picking up. Okay. So we use indifference curve maps to find utility maximizing consumption bundles. The optimal consumption bundle lies on the budget line. I'm spending all my money. That's what that says. And the marginal utility per dollar spent is the same for every good in the bundle. So if bagels cost half of what a book costs, boy, my last book should give me twice the pleasure of my last bagel, because that last book cost me twice as much. That's the intuition there. I want to spend my last dollar so that I'm getting the same amount of pleasure from each of the things that I'm buying if I'm at the optimal point. If my marginal utility per dollar spent was really high for books and really low for bagels, what I should do is buy a few fewer bagels and shift that money into the books. Okay? So that marginal rate of substitution, that slope of that indifference curve, is really important. And I should say the slope of that indifference curve can change as we move away from the origin. And in particular, things in necessities and luxuries, we see that matters. that there's certain things that we really are willing to spend a lot of money on when we're rich, that we're not really willing to spend a lot of money on when we're poor. I see all these ads, I get consumer reports, and they're describing, why they like the Lexus SUV better than the Hyundai equivalent. And I'm just thinking, and they're describing, how the console, you can get Apple Play doing all kinds of cool things and the more expensive one. And I'm just like, I don't care about that. If I were sort of super rich, I might be willing to do that. But, there's just a bunch of things that, I'm just not willing to spend money on super high quality vehicle because, I can't be wasting my money on stuff like that. And so the slope of the indifference curve may be different as we get to higher, as we get to higher levels of income. And I start to just, I start to really care a lot about, do I have leather appointments on the steering wheel in the Lexus SUV versus, vinyl? If I ever get $100 million, I probably I wouldn't have to have leather because I don't think that's ethical, but I'd want to have something nice, in that spot. And the current me, I just can't care about that. So, so basically we're always comparing the value I get from the last book or the last coffee. The marginal rate of substitution is what am I getting for the last unit of the thing that I'm buying? And I think Krugman and Wells does a really nice things. And as I mentioned down here, this is clearly suboptimal. I should, if books cost 10 times as much as the last cup of coffee, but only getting 3 times as much value for the last book, I'm buying too many books if I'm at this point. So this is really the trade-offs that are picked up. This is basically the slope of that curve here. So, between V and W, if I'm indifferent between V and W, it's basically saying going from 2 rooms to 3 rooms is the benefit of doing that is equivalent to the loss in my well-being of going from 30 meals down to 20. That's why I'm on the same indifference curve. Those two things have to offset each other if I'm on the same indifference curve. If I'm over here, going from 5 rooms to 6 rooms, that benefit from that is exactly the same as if I went from 12 meals down to 10. So each of these meals between Y and Z is worth a lot more relative to the rooms when I'm in this region than when I'm up here. And it's because down here, I already have a ton of rooms. I don't really need another night in a nice hotel room. So this convex shape here is reflecting the declining marginal utility of the goods. As this curve gets more vertical up here, I just not willing to trade off much to get another restaurant meal. Down here, I'm not willing to trade off much to get another room. Okay. So, so moving down the indifference curves, produces 2 offsetting effects. And if you're on the same indifference curve, they must exactly cancel out. That's really what this slide is saying. Okay. Now, if we do a little bit of math, we can figure out the slope of the indifference curve. And it turns out the slope of the indifference curve is going to be the ratio of the marginal utilities of each of these items. So, if I change the number of restaurant meals I have, the change in my overall utility is what's my marginal utility of another meal times how many meals I've changed. That's roughly how much my utils have moved. Similarly, what's the change in utility from changing how many rooms I consume? It's the marginal utility of a room multiplied by how many rooms I'm changing. There's an assumption in this, which is that if I take a really small change in this curve here, that it kind of looks a lot like a straight line. If B and W are really close together, the marginal utility doesn't change very much. between V and W. And if you're familiar with the calculus, you can see this is really trying to take the slope of the line, slope of this nonlinear thing, and by taking 2 points that are really close together and applying these formulas. So while you're along the indifference curve, the change in my meals, the change in utils that comes from consuming a little bit more meals has to be exactly offset from the change in my utils if I have to consume a few fewer rooms, to finance that. And so the ratio, when I cross multiply these things, which is what's going to happen on the next slide, the ratio of the marginal utilities is really important for the slope of that curve. And so that's just 2 kids that I saw at the Lyle July 4th celebration, and it actually reminded me that happened to be one day after a friend of mine from middle school had passed from breast cancer, and she and I used to hang out and at events like this, and somehow I saw that picture and it was meaningful to me. I generally never take pictures of children, but I made an exception that day in silhouette. So along the indifference curve, this is basically the slope of the indifference curve. The change in y over the change in x. It's given by the ratio of the marginal utilities. There's a minus sign. Why is there a minus sign there? Because the curve is sloping down. That's why the minus sign is there. And notice that over here we have the rooms in the denominator. Over here we have the rooms in the numerator. So we sort of flip these ratios. You'll see that. Now notice that it's the marginal utility of the rooms divided by the marginal utility of the meals. That's this. That slope, but we've reversed that slope. So if a room is worth a ton, and if I'm at a point where the marginal utility of the rooms are really high and the marginal utility of the meals is very low, this is basically saying that I'm going to be really. Let me go up to the curve and see if I can show you where let's just find if I'm way up here, this slope is a really big negative number. And what it is, it's the marginal utility of the rooms divided by the marginal utility of the meals at this point. And the marginal utility of a meal at this point is just a very small number because I have so many meals. So I'm going to get some really big negative number because the marginal utility of the rooms is just a lot bigger at this point than the marginal utility of the meals. And that's what's showing up in this formula. And that's the marginal rate of substitution. Okay. So I'm belaboring the point about the about the intuition here. But it's really, what am I willing to trade off between these two goods at the margin? Well, I love the way PowerPoint has its automatic pagination. I'm now on slide 94 out of 35. That may be the way you're feeling listening to me as I describe this. So if 2 goods are ordinary goods in a consumer utility function, when the consumer requires some additional units of R to compensate if I have less M and vice versa, and there's diminishing marginal rate of substitution when substituting one good in place of the other. It's basically saying I start to I'm getting bored with rooms if I have a lot of rooms, and I sort of need fewer meals to compensate for that. And of course, if we made a sufficiently complicated set of mathematical exceptions to that, we can come up with ways that these assumptions can be violated, but those are usually exceptions that we have to talk about specifically. Okay. So what am I trying to do in life? I'm trying to reach the highest indifference curve given my budget constraint. So here we've got somebody that's trying to find their bliss point, between meals and rooms. And this line is given to them by their economic environment in two ways. One is their income, and the second is what is the relative prices of the meals versus the rooms. So this, remember, the slope of the budget line is the ratio of the prices with a negative sign in front of it. So this budget line is, that's just dictated by the market in a lot of ways. The indifference curve is dictated by what's happening inside my head to a great extent. How much do I enjoy meals versus restaurant? How much do I enjoy meals versus hotel rooms? So everybody's got their own indifference curve. But when we have these curves, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find the highest curve I can reach that's still reachable with given my budget line. So like I3, I can't be on this curve here. I just don't have enough money to reach it. I could be at I1. If I was at point C or at point B, I would be at I1. That's not optimal for me. Over in C, I'm basically consuming too many rooms. I just don't value my last room that much. And you can see that because the curve is very flat here. So I'm just not gaining much for my last couple rooms. So if I start to move a little bit towards A, I'm going to be on some sort of a higher curve. I haven't drawn it, but there's something between I1 and I2 that's just a little bit better than I1. I keep coming up until I get to the highest curve I can just reach at point A. Notice the way that kind of comes down and it just kisses that point right there. See? So I2 is the highest indifference curve I can reach. And if you think about what it means, that it just kisses that point, it basically says that the indifference curve is exactly parallel to that budget line right at that bliss point. See here, when the curve is intersecting that budget line in a really flat way, it means if I move up this way, there's another indifference curve that's going to be a little bit higher that's still going to hit that budget line. And similarly here, it's so steep. If I move a little bit down here, there's going to be another curve that's just a little bit to the right of point B where I can still hit the budget line and be at a little bit higher utility. And I keep moving, but then when I just kiss it, when there's just one, the indifference curve just comes down and just touches it at A and then veers off. I can't go, there's no point, there's no way I can get to a higher indifference curve anymore. And that's called the tangency condition. And the slope's just equal there. And it's saying the marginal rate of substitution between rooms and meals exactly equals the relative prices at that point. So, here rooms cost 5 times as much as meals. So this slope has to match that. Now that at point A, my marginal rate of substitution is going to be 5 to 1 there. That indifference curve has got it's at a point where the marginal utility of a room is actually 5 times the marginal utility of a meal at that point. And that's what makes that exact tangency condition. It's kind of profound, actually. And there just kind of touches it. Okay? So here's the budget line. I've already done all this in class. I won't do it more, but you could see we could work out the y equals mx plus b thing, and you notice that the slope of this thing is the ratio of the prices, where notice that the meals, I've got the price of the room divided by the price of the meals is what's showing up right here. And that's it's important to remember that if I've got meals on the y-axis, the slope of this line is minus the price of the thing that's on the x-axis divided by the price of the thing that's on the y-axis. That's important to get from this. It's very easy to forget which way it goes, but that's the way it goes. Okay. So, and the idea is if I consume one more room, it's going to cost me the price of a room times 1. How many meals is that going to cost me? It's the dollars that I've just spent on the rooms, but then I've got to say, well, then I've also got to divide by the price of the meals to sort of figure out how that converts into meals. And that's what this slope gives me. And the book, I think, does a nice job of explaining all this. Okay. So this fraction here is exactly how many meals I have to give up to get one extra room, the ratio of the prices. Okay. Now, what happens if I change my income? The budget line shifts up and down. Notice that if I didn't change the price of the meals and the price of the rooms, this line is completely, these lines are all completely parallel. The only thing that I'm changing is I'm changing this y-intercept term if I increase my income, but the slope stays exactly the same. So these lines are just going to be completely parallel. Okay. So an income thing just changes, it moves my budget line, but doesn't change the slope of it. Okay. So we've got the relative price rule, which I've beaten to death now, but it's really, this thing is really important. And so I won't, I've been beating it to death, but this is an important thing. Okay. And so and again, it's this tangency condition that matters a lot. And so I'll just keep hammering away on this, but that's the basic point. Okay. Now, when we say consumers have different preferences, we mean that they have different utility functions. And that's really the most important thing, is their indifference curve has different slopes. And the different slopes of the indifference curves lead to different choices by consumers who, even when they have the same income and they face the same prices. Okay. So here we have Ingrid and we have Lars. So if we look at this, we see that Lars has flatter indifference curves by and large. So what does that mean? It means that Lars has, his marginal rate of substitution is such that he's willing to give up more rooms to get restaurant meals at the margin than Ingrid is. So how is that showing up? And we're going to look for the point where the indifference curve just is going to have this come down and kiss that budget line. I'm looking for the highest indifference curve that I can reach that touches that budget line. So what Lars is doing is, he starts at I1, and he's got exactly the same budget line as Ingrid. But in order for him to have the point on the indifference curve that's got the same slope at this budget line, he's actually got to go a little bit further to the left than Ingrid is, because his curve gets flat so fast that that if he's looking for a point on his indifference curve where the slope of the indifference curve is this steep, he's got to come pretty far over to the left in order to find that. So like here, he's at this point I2 where the curve starts to really swing up, where he's getting 60 meals and he's getting 4 rooms. And it's basically, he's bored by rooms once he has more than a handful of them. So he ends up here. Now, Ingrid, she's a lot more into the rooms and she gets bored with the meals a lot faster. So her curves get steep faster. So, when she starts over, say, from all the way on the right, her curves are getting steeper a lot faster. So she hits that point where it's got the same slope as the budget line at 8 meals. Now, if she's getting 8 meals rather than 4, she's going to have fewer meals to go with that. So she ends up at a point where she's got more rooms than he does. He's got more meals than she does. They're both spending exactly the same amount of money, but their different consumption choices matter. Okay. So, so you can see that they're both spending exactly the same amount of money, but they're just doing it in a different way. Now let's talk about substitutes and complements. That's Peter Falk. So what determines whether goods are substitutes or complements? It depends on the shape of a consumer's indifference curve. And let's just talk about some extreme cases, perfect substitutes and perfect complements. Okay? Here's perfect substitutes. Two goods are perfect substitutes if the marginal rate of substitution of one good in place of the other is just constant no matter how much we're consuming. So let's suppose that I really don't care whether a cookie is a peanut butter cookie or a chocolate chip cookie. They're exact. I'm indifferent between them. You could think of like I'm playing tennis and I've got orange tennis balls and I've got green tennis balls. I just don't care what the color is of the ball. They're perfect substitutes. So this is actually my indifference curve here. So 10 chocolate chip cookies is worth exactly the same to me, and 0 peanut butter cookies is exactly the same as 10 peanut butter cookies and 0 chocolate chip, or 6 and 4, 5 and 5. I just don't care what the mix is among them. You know, of course, I'm at a higher indifference curve if I can have 12 cookies, but the indifference curve is completely a straight line. That's what it means when things are substitutes. Now, it doesn't mean that the slope has to be -1. Suppose that the peanut butter cookies were half the size of the chocolate chip cookies, but they were otherwise, I didn't care which was which. You could imagine that I had a straight line indifference curve, but it reflected the different size of the cookies. So I needed 2 of the smaller cookies to match 1 of the bigger cookies, but I really don't care beyond that what the combination is of the bigger and smaller cookies. And so when two goods are perfect substitutes, one of the interesting things is that a small price change can lead to a really large change in consumption because I'm just going to buy whichever one is cheaper. So here, Koki only buys peanut butter cookies. And, here's, why is that? The budget line is this orange thing here. So it turns out, so you see the way it's done? Peanut butter cookies are a little bit cheaper. 12 peanut butter cookies cost the same as 10 chocolate chip cookies. And these green things are my indifference curves. I really don't care what the color is of the cookie. I'm just going to buy the cheaper one. So if the peanut butter cookies are just a little cheaper, I'm going to be at A. I'm just going to buy all of the peanut butter cookies. Now here we kind of have the opposite situation where the chocolate chip cookies are a little cheaper. So now I'm just going to want to be at B. Now, this is a fake example, but when you have goods when you have very close substitutes, this is basically saying you have a really high cross price elasticity. So imagine that I like to drink beer and there's Miller Lite and there's Bud Light. And if you really blindfolded me, I couldn't tell which one I was drinking. I'm going to buy whichever one is cheaper. And so I'm going to be really sensitive to the relative prices of these two things. If Miller beer becomes 10% cheaper, wow, I might shift all my beer consumption over in that direction. So when things are really close substitutes, customers are really sensitive to price differences. And notice by that means that, wow, there's a lot of competition between those two things that is based on price. That is, by the way, a very bad situation for both Miller Lite and for Bud Light in that situation. They do not want consumers to think of themselves, in this perfect substitute way, because basically they're competing on price. And of course, if you're in a business, you don't want to compete on price because there's a real straight up zero sum aspect to that, where you end up both brands of beer end up having to really cut their prices, and it cuts into their profits. One of the interesting things is how you could imagine that each side of the market has an incentive in reducing that sense of substitutedness. So for example, suppose that I have the market for coffee, and I've got Dunkin' Donuts coffee, and I've got Starbucks coffee. If consumers see them as perfect substitutes, they're really competing on price. That's not so great for them. Suppose that Dunkin' Donuts runs a bunch of ads where they're like, Dunkin's a cup of Joe from Dunkin's is really that's keeping it real. That's for the working people. And we give you your coffee. We don't make a big deal about it. It's for the we're not going to describe to you how we massage the coffee bean. Just here's your coffee, put some cream and sugar in it, and here it is. And Starbucks coffee is for the people that sort of want to come in and listen to James Taylor and get a sense of their coffee as somehow part of some deep cultural experience. I'm communing with this cup of coffee in some profound cultural way. What's interesting is that if they set up that sense of differentiation, both Dunkin's and Starbucks can benefit from that. Because someone like Harold Pollack, who's a reverse snob, would say, yeah, I'm going to go to Dunkin's. I don't want to get into the, I'm not even going to tell anybody that I got James Taylor going on in my iPhone. It's on my playlist. But I don't want to be identified with that Starbucks thing. And so I'm a little bit less sensitive to the price of the Dunkin's thing because I'm just not going to buy the Starbucks. And similarly, the Starbucks person is, I'm not going to buy that crummy coffee that the Pollock people buy. I want to have the coffee that really shows some sophistication here. So I'm not even looking at the price of the Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I'm going to Starbucks. You can see how they both could benefit by making less of a substitutedness. And a lot of what advertising is it is creating that sense of product differentiation so that you get out of the peanut butter versus chocolate chip cookie thing. And, if you think about it, if you have a super differentiated product, they don't really have to spend a lot of money advertising to explain the attributes of the product. They might have to do some advertising, tell you where you can get it or something like that. But, Google doesn't run a lot of ads that say, web search is kind of useful. It's actually kind of nice that you can get on your computer and, figure out who won the World Series in 1975. They don't need to do that. They don't have a close substitute, for that. It's kind of too bad that they don't for a number of reasons. But if you think about what a lot of advertising is, it's just trying to differentiate your product from a close substitute. Don't buy any cheap imitations. Okay? Perfect complements. This is also kind of an interesting thing. So here in indifference curves, we have perfect complements. You could think of that as milk and cookies, or you could think of it as right shoes and left shoes. So let's think about I4. Let's think about what's going on here. We're at point B where we have 4 cookies and we have 4 glasses of milk. And we have this point C, which we're saying is on the same indifference curve where I have 5 cookies and I've got 4 glasses of milk. What this is saying is I don't value a cookie if I don't have a glass of milk to go with it. Like how much is a new right shoe worth if I don't have another left shoe to go with it? Nothing. It's so perfect complements. You tend to get this really steep thing. Peanut butter is only worth it to me if I've got some jelly to go with it. That kind of thing. These are perfect complements. Okay. So the perfect substitutes is the complete straight line indifference curve. Perfect complements is the right angle indifference curves. Now, of course, real goods is going to be some amalgam of these two things, but these are sort of useful examples. Okay? By interesting debate, are goods substitutes or complements is often an interesting policy question. Before I get to this particular slide, I'll mention one of the big policy issues we have with cannabis is it a substitute or a complement for cigarettes? Is it a substitute or a complement for alcohol? If we think that cannabis is a gateway drug to using other intoxicants, it's basically saying it's kind of a complement for some other things. That would make us more worried about doing things that might increase cannabis consumption. If it's a substitute, we might think, hey, there's something good about people using cannabis. It means they're drinking less or they're using less of another harmful substance. When audio file sharing took off in the late 1990s, people really argued about it. A lot of musicians really didn't like sharing of audio files because they thought, hey, you're stealing my stuff. And some of the people who were involved in the sharing said, no, you don't understand. When people start listening when people start downloading free electronic files of your music, they're also going to buy CDs that you're producing, and they're going to be into your old album. And that the file sharing is kind of free publicity. Turns out, no, these things were substitutes. That once people had opportunities to download for free, they stopped buying CDs and stuff. And if you look at where musicians make money, it's really live performance more than it was 30 years ago, in part because there's so much free downloaded stuff. So that turns out to be important. Okay. Now, how would our consumption change if our price of goods change or our income changes? And let's see the effect of a price increase, and then we'll think of an income increase. Okay. So what happens if we really increase the price of rooms a lot? Rooms go from $150 to $600. Here's the old budget line. My income stays the same. The whole thing rotates, because now the most I could do is the most I could buy if I have a total income of $2,400. The most I can get is 4 rooms. So this y-intercept doesn't change at all because I haven't changed the price of meals. The whole budget line rotates like that. Okay? But I'm a lot poorer now because look at all the range here I used to be able to buy, I can't buy anymore. These used to be feasible for me, now they're infeasible. So the budget line really moved with that price increase. Okay. Now, how are people going to respond to that price increase? First of all, they're going to be in a lower indifference curve. I can't reach I2 anymore because rooms are so expensive. So I'm going to end up at some point that's way up here, that's just got way more meals and way less rooms, because the price is so different. Now, what's interesting about this, though, is that there's kind of 2 things happening in this example that are conceptually worth distinguishing. One is each room costs me a ton. So on the margin, I just want fewer rooms because it's just too expensive. If you made Starbucks coffee $10,000, I'm just not going to do it. Or if you made Starbucks coffee $20, I might go a couple of times, just as a treat or something if I like Starbucks coffee. But that price increase just makes me, I'm going to buy Dunkin's instead. There's something else happening too in this example, though, because really I only have 2 goods I can buy from. Effectively, this has made me poorer. If you raise the price of Starbucks coffee from whatever it is now, $4 to $20, it doesn't make Harold really poorer, but it does make Harold not want to spend $20 at Starbucks. But it doesn't change my overall situation. If you raise the price of something that I have to buy a lot of, like my mortgage becomes way more expensive, it's not just that it's changing my trade-off between housing and other things, but I'm also kind of now effectively poorer because I have to spend money, on my housing. And if that gets way more expensive, I just have less money to spend on everything else. So, but you can see in this example, I'm really going to move over towards the restaurant meals to a great extent. Now, how much I move depends to some extent on how did the shape of these curves change at these different levels. So if for example, suppose that restaurant meals were a real necessity for whatever reason, I might move a little bit higher up on this curve than if they were kind of a luxury. Right? Now, if I change my income, the budget line shifts as a parallel line. So if this is my original line, you raise my income, I come up to this new line. You lower my income, I go down to this other line. Slope stays the same. That's going to change my consumption too. This particular thing, notice that I haven't really changed the fraction of my income that I'm spending on each good. This is sometimes called a homothetic situation, where the sort of degree of necessity and luxuriness of these two goods is basically the same at different levels of income. See, these curves are basically, the shapes are basically the same. And so I'm kind of staying, if I drew a line from origin to B, it would basically also hit A. I'm not really changing the share of each of these goods that I'm buying as my income changes. That's one scenario. And that can pertain. Now, if I have an inferior good, it doesn't look like that. Okay, so here we have a different situation. So, so what's happening here? So I've got secondhand furniture over here and restaurant meals over here. At my low income, I'm relatively consuming a decent amount of the secondhand furniture, and I'm really not having very many restaurant meals, because notice how quickly the restaurant meal, this curve starts to get vertical pretty quick. It's the marginal utility for me at that low income level of another restaurant meal starts to be really low compared to the marginal utility of some more furniture in my house when I don't have enough money to have both. When my income goes up a lot, I just don't want secondhand furniture anymore very much. So I'm really shifting a lot towards the restaurant meals. Now, if it wasn't secondhand furniture, but it was a luxury up here and a necessity down here, it wouldn't actually go. I wouldn't actually end up reducing how much I'm consuming, but I would definitely be shifting in the direction of consuming more on the luxury good and less on the necessity as my income goes up. So this is kind of an extreme case because I've got an inferior good. Okay. So I probably should have in here, if I had a necessity versus a luxury, maybe instead of being a D, it would be somewhere over here. It'd be somewhere, maybe at this spot where I'm consuming a little bit more of the necessity than I was at the lower income, but the share of my income I'm spending on that is way lower than it was when my income was a lot lower. So if I didn't make this secondhand furniture, but I made it store brand cereal, I still consume more of it. I like cereal, but I wouldn't consume that much more of it if I had more money. So the change in a consumer's optimal consumption bundle caused by a change in price reflects the substitution effect that I've changed the slope of the budget line, and it's got an income effect because my purchasing power has changed. Most of the time, the substitution effect is more important, but the income effect can be important. And it's really, economists, when you do the math, you can sort of say, hey, I'm roughly going to find where along my same indifference curve can I match the slope of my new budget line. That's really what this bullet is about. So normally the income and substitution effects work in the same direction. So if I have two goods that I'm consuming, I make Starbucks coffee more expensive. I'm going to consume less Starbucks coffee because the substitution effect says, boy, coffee's more expensive now, so I'm consuming less. Plus the income effect, I have a little bit less money to spend because the money that I do spend on my coffee, it's taking more of my income away. There are occasionally examples where it goes the other way. Giffen goods are the classic example. I don't know why we have some possibilities where that can happen. It is the only thing that I think a better example than Giffen goods would be if there's certain kinds of high status goods that become higher status goods when they become more expensive, and it could be so there are some weird examples, but I think the really important point is most of the time the substitution effect is really the important thing, except when we're talking about some core thing that people spend a lot of their money on. So, really, and that's housing, food, fuel, healthcare potentially for people with a serious health issue. That's where you see, if the price of prescription drugs goes up, you could imagine someone with a really serious chronic illness taking expensive medication. That's a big income hit for them under our current system. So there are times when some good that's really we're just spending a lot of our money on, where you have to think about the income effect. So again, in housing, imagine that you leave Chicago, you take a job, you get your degree from Crown, you take a job in Manhattan, and rents are just vastly more expensive in Manhattan than in Chicago. So part of it is that you're gonna live in a smaller apartment. Maybe you'll take a roommate, and that's kind of the substitution effect. But you're also finding, wow, even with a roommate, I'm still spending 50% more on housing in Manhattan than I am in Hyde Park. Well, I'm going to eat out less often. I'm going to buy a smaller car or whatever. That's where that income effect changes your preferences. Now, it can happen on the earning side, sometimes the other way. Suppose that you get a job where your hourly wage really dramatically increases. There's going to be an income effect and a substitution effect, which actually kind of go in the opposite directions in some ways. So, if somebody says, do you want to work another hour of overtime? You're like, yeah, I'm getting $60 instead of $30. Wow, that's, that makes it more desirable to work more overtime. On the other hand, you may have more money. You may be in less need to work overtime. You may say, I actually want to do more vacations. I'm not sure I want to work as much overtime now. I kind of have all my basic needs met, and I'm kind of tired. And so you could imagine the income effect makes you want to work fewer hours, even though the substitution effect makes you want to work more hours. Okay. That's James Fallows. That was our conversation on the YouTube. I'm kind of disappointed that people aren't watching the YouTube's videos very much, but I guess you got your own marginal rate of substitution across different products, so I got to respect that. Now here's an exam question, the midterm exam question that I actually kept this for this lecture. I didn't put it in the answer key video, and I probably should have, but I kind of thought it would be nice to have it as a piece in this one. So here we have books and bagels, and we've got the indifference curves that that Professor Gorman Smith has at different, her different curves as she sort of moves away from the origin. Which of these is a necessity and which is a luxury for her? How do you think about that? Well, the main thing is what's happening to these curves as we move away from the origin. They're getting flatter, right? So as she's out here, an extra bagel is not worth very much to her compared, down here where she's at this pretty low level of resources. There's a noticeable verticality to this thing. An extra bagel is definitely going to move her to a higher indifference curve. As we move up, an extra bagel, she's pretty much staying on the same indifference curve. So that's really kind of saying she's hitting more quickly, getting bored with bagels. At low income, an extra bagel really does move her to a higher indifference curve. So bagels are more likely to be a necessity. But as if she's at some pretty high income level, the way to get her to move up to a higher indifference curve is to get her another book. If she's sitting here, she gets another book, she's moving to a higher indifference curve. She gets another bagel, she's kind of staying on the old indifference curve. Maybe she's going up to one that's got one more util, but you give her one more book, wow, she's up at a higher point. That relationship is more equally balanced down here. You give her another book, yeah, she's going to benefit a lot, but you give her another bagel, she's going to benefit a lot too. So for this particular one, a bagel is more likely to be a necessity for her, and book is a little more likely to be a luxury for her. and the idea is the higher indifference curves are much flatter. Now that's sort of not interesting because it's a play example. Let's think about a real example where we think about is health status a necessity or a luxury for a society? And there's parts of this problem that are made up, and there are parts of it that are not made up. So here's China 1990 to 2012. Lifespan goes from 68.6 years to 74.9 years. And in inflation-adjusted terms, income goes from 1,790 to 6,076. By the way, if we did this for 2020, lifespan goes up to 77.93 years, and income goes to 8,666. This is all inflation adjusted. You say, what is the most valuable thing in the history of the world? Here you have, in a space of 30 years, lifespan going up by more than 9 years, per capita income going up by a factor of 5. That's pretty freaking awesome. There's a lot of problems with if you say, are there some major issues with the rise of China as a superpower in the world? Yes, there are. But boy, it's hard to think of too many other things where hundreds of millions and billions of human beings benefited so profoundly. But we might say, how valuable in dollars was that increase in lifespan to people living in China? And what's interesting about that is that the 1990 person would probably give a different answer than the 2012 person in terms of what they would be willing to trade off in health versus income if we had all their indifference curves, because the 2012 person has an income 5 times as large. Okay? So here's just the indifference curves. I should say that the blue dots are real things. The red is kind of made up. But notice that the 2012 curve is steeper than the 1990 curve. And the idea behind this is the 2012 person, they've got a lot of stuff. So if you said to that 2012 person, how much would you be willing to give? Well, let me phrase it differently. If you say to the 2012 person, how much is it worth it to you that you've moved from 68.6 year life expectancy to 74.9 year life expectancy? Wow, it's worth a lot. And the way that you could ask that question is, how much money would I have to pay you to get you back to 68.6 year life expectancy for you to think that it's worth it? And the 2012 person says, you'd have to pay me a lot of money. These are obviously made up numbers. You have to pay me a lot of money. Now, if you said to the person in 1990 who's living at this 68.6 years, and you say, how much would you be willing to pay to go from your current life expectancy to 74.9 years? In some ways, that's the same question. Of course, it's asked in the reverse. That person would not be willing to pay that much in this, the way I've drawn it. And why is that? Because they don't have a lot of resources to pay. So, if you're at 1790 per capita income, you definitely want to live to that longer lifespan. But, you're really at a point where your basic needs are more difficult to meet. If you're the 2012 person, you're like, I got a lot of stuff, if I could live another 9 years on average, boy, I'd be happy to give up a lot of my income. And how much would you have to pay me to take a shorter lifespan? Boy, you'd have to pay me a lot. I would sure. It's pretty fun to live the way I'm living now. You'd have to pay me a lot to give up all this lifespan. And so they're equally valuable humans, but the 1990 person is willing to pay a lot less for health status and lifespan than the 2012 person, because they're just at a different level of wealth. And it's really saying that lifespan is more of a luxury in that sense than for those people. And there's no so it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. You'd have to pay the 2012 person a lot more money to get back to 68.6 to on this higher indifference curve than the 1990 person would be willing to pay to get to the 2012 lifespan. If you gave the 1990 person that you had the same level of income over here, you say, how much would I have to pay you to go back to your original lifespan? Not that much. Just because of the difference in preferences that comes with differences in wealth. And there are many things where when a society is at a low level of per capita income, they're just not in a position to pay for stuff that people in a wealthier society are more willing to pay for. And sometimes that's life expectancy, sometimes it's environmental amenities. It's just a bunch of stuff that when you're in a low income environment, you're just not going to prioritize in the same way. And so if you say 1990, how much would people have been willing to pay to raise their lifespan 6.3 years? Let me just say this again. It's the amount they'd be willing to reduce their income to get to the longer lifespan that corresponds to 2012. And as drawn in the made up numbers, they'd only be willing to pay about $290 a year to get to that. Now, from a 2012 perspective, you say, how much would you have to be paid to go back to 1990? And the way I drew the curves, that's $1,000 a year. And it's people have a lot more money to pay for health. It's kind of more fun to be alive when you're rich, and the stuff that you give up is less valuable to you. You're sort of at a okay, I already have a lot of restaurant meals, I can give up some. And health is a normal good. To some extent, it's a luxury, and that turns out to be kind of interesting when we're trying to do cost benefit analysis in a global way. And this midterm question that I asked, this is kind of a play example, but it kind of gets to that. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording.